The house was quiet, bathed in the stillness of a late October night. Julia, 30 years old and weary from a long week, had finally drifted off to sleep. Her roommate Emma was due back tomorrow from her work trip, and for once, the house felt like it was all hers. She liked it that way. No noise, no interruptions, just the soft hum of the wind against the windows, lulling her into a deep, dreamless sleep. But something pulled her from that sleep. A sound, faint at first but unmistakable. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps from downstairs. Julia stirred, groggily opening her eyes, her heart beating a little faster. She lay still for a moment, listening. Maybe it was just her imagination. But there it was again. The creak of a floorboard, the subtle shift of weight as someone moved around on the first floor. Her first thought was Emma. Maybe her roommate had come home early? That was the only logical explanation. She checked the clock on her bedside table. 2:35 a.m. Emma hadn't mentioned coming back tonight, but maybe there was a last-minute change. Julia tried to shake off the unease and sat up, rubbing her eyes, trying to clear the fog from her mind. The footsteps continued. Deciding to check, Julia swung her legs over the side of the bed and slipped on her robe, the fabric cold against her skin. The house was dark except for the faint orange glow of the street lamp outside, casting long eerie shadows through the blinds. As she made her way to the door, her fingers hesitated on the knob. Something felt off. The footsteps, they weren't moving like Emma's. They were slower, heavier, and they didn't sound like someone who had just come home, relaxed and unwinding. They sounded like someone looking for something. Her pulse quickened, a knot forming in her stomach. Julia cracked open her bedroom door and peered out into the hallway. Everything looked normal, but the sound was clearer now, closer. She could hear the shuffling of feet, a soft thud as something knocked against the wall. Her breath hitched. "Emma?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper, though every fiber of her being hoped for an answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. Only the footsteps continued. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stepped into the hallway, each of her own movements feeling too loud in the oppressive quiet. Slowly, she descended the stairs, one hand gripping the banister, the other pressed to her mouth to muffle her shallow breathing. The moment her foot touched the bottom step, she froze. Standing in the middle of the living room, his back turned to her, was a man. Not Emma. Not anyone she knew. He was tall, maybe 180 centimeters, bald and eerily still. His frame cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the dim room. The man stood in a slight crouch, as if listening to something Julia couldn't hear, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. Julia's mind raced. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. Who the hell was he? And how did he get inside? Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly backed up, her foot barely grazing the stair behind her. But that tiny sound, that faint scuff of her heel on the wood, was enough. He turned. For the briefest second, Julia saw his face, illuminated by the pale light filtering through the window. He was expressionless, his eyes wide, hollow, his skin pale and stretched tight across his skull. No eyebrows, no stubble, just the strange blank mask of a face staring straight at her. Julia's blood ran cold as the man's lips curled into a grotesque grin. Without thinking, she turned and bolted back up the stairs, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. Behind her, she heard him move. Fast. Too fast. The sound of his feet thundering against the hardwood floors was deafening now, chasing her up the stairs. He was running, barreling through the house like a wild animal, knocking over furniture, slamming into walls, his breaths coming out in guttural, uneven gasps. Julia barely made it to the top of the stairs before diving into the closest room, the linen closet. She slid inside and closed the door as quietly as she could manage, pressing herself against the shelves, trying to disappear into the towels and blankets that crowded the space. Her hand covered her mouth to stifle the sound of her panicked breathing as the footsteps thundered up the stairs. Then came the screaming. It was a scream unlike anything she had ever heard, hoarse, unrelenting, as though it was being torn from him. The walls seemed to tremble with the force of it. And then, just as suddenly, he stopped. The house fell silent once more, but she knew he was still out there, somewhere, waiting. Julia squeezed her eyes shut, praying that the silence would last. But deep down she knew it wouldn't. The darkness in the closet pressed in on Julia, making the air thick and suffocating. Time had warped into something unrecognizable, a slow, torturous drip of seconds that felt like hours. She had no idea how long she'd been hiding, minutes, hours, a lifetime. Her body was curled into a tight ball, wedged between piles of towels, her muscles screaming in silent agony from remaining so still for so long. She had barely breathed since diving into the closet, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle any sound. Her mind was a chaotic mess trying to process what had just happened. The man, that thing, had been real. The bald, expressionless face, the unhinged scream, the sheer speed with which he had moved, none of it made sense. She could still hear his footsteps pounding through the house, feel the vibration of him slamming into walls, tearing through the furniture in his blind fury. The noise had echoed in her skull, but now there was nothing. Silence had fallen again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was tense, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the nightmare to continue. Julia pressed her ear against the closet door, straining to hear any movement. The house was dead quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. No footsteps. No screams. She had no idea where the man was or if he was still inside. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to stay put, to keep hiding until daylight, but something deep inside her stirred, an overwhelming urge to escape. She needed to get help. She couldn't stay there forever. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, half expecting it to make some noise that would give her away, but the screen was dark and silent. She still had no signal. The storm from earlier must have knocked out the nearby cell towers, but maybe, just maybe, the phone line still worked. She had to risk it. Slowly, she eased the closet door open, just enough to peek out into the hallway. The house was bathed in a weak, ghostly light, the kind that only seems to exist in the dead of night. The stairs leading to the first floor loomed like a black chasm, but there was no sign of movement. No shadow lurking in the hallway. The man was nowhere to be seen. Julia crawled out of the closet, her limbs stiff from hours of hiding. Her heart pounded as she tiptoed down the hall toward the staircase. The wooden floor creaked under her weight, and each tiny sound sent her pulse racing, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close. The living room came into view, dimly lit by the streetlight filtering through the window. The furniture was in disarray, chairs overturned, books scattered across the floor, the coffee table split down the middle as though someone had smashed into it. He had done this. The man, in his crazed frenzy, had torn through the room like a tornado. But now it was eerily still. Julia's eyes darted to the front door. It was closed but unlocked. She hadn't had time to lock it when she'd fled. That's how he must have gotten in. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. She swallowed hard and made her way to the kitchen, where the landline phone was mounted on the wall. Her fingers shook as she lifted the receiver and dialed 911, the sharp beeps of the buttons unnervingly loud in the silence. She held her breath, praying that the line hadn't been cut, that the storm hadn't taken it down too. One ring. 2. 911, what's your emergency? Julia exhaled in a shaky breath. There's a man in my house, she whispered, her voice hoarse from fear. He broke in. He's been. I don't know where he is now, but he was upstairs. He's dangerous. Please send someone. The dispatcher's voice was calm and steady, but Julia barely heard it through the rush of blood in her ears. Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Can you lock yourself somewhere safe until they arrive? Julia nodded, forgetting for a moment that the dispatcher couldn't see her. Yes. I'll lock myself in the bathroom. She hung up before the dispatcher could respond, the weight of the phone suddenly too much to bear. Her eyes flicked toward the living room again. No sign of him. No sound. She could feel the seconds stretching, thick with tension. Where was he? She took one step toward the hallway, then another. She was halfway to the bathroom when the front door swung open with a loud crack, as though it had been kicked in. The force rattled the walls. Julia froze in place, her breath catching in her throat. Several dark figures poured into the house, moving fast, sweeping through the rooms like shadows. At first, Julia's mind went blank with panic. Were these more intruders? Was this a group of them? But then the unmistakable glint of badges caught her eye. The police. 2 officers spotted her standing in the hallway, her pale face stark against the dimness of the house. One of them rushed toward her, his hand raised to calm her. Ma'am, are you all right? Did you call us? Julia nodded numbly, her knees buckling with the overwhelming relief. He's still here somewhere, she managed, pointing toward the stairs. Upstairs, I think. The officer motioned to the others, and within seconds they were storming the second floor, their shouts and the pounding of boots reverberating through the house. Julia stood frozen in place, every muscle locked in fear, waiting for the nightmare to be over. And then it came. A series of guttural screams, horrible and raw, erupted from upstairs. The sound of furniture crashing and heavy footsteps followed. Julia pressed herself against the wall, hands clamped over her ears as the chaos unfolded. Get him down. Now, one of the officers bellowed. There was a struggle, loud, violent, and then the unmistakable crack of a taser. A few seconds later, the heavy thump of a body hitting the floor. More footsteps. More shouts. And then silence. Julia could hardly breathe as two officers emerged from the staircase, dragging the man between them. He was unconscious, his body limp but still radiating that same unsettling energy. He looked even more terrifying up close, his bald head slick with sweat, his expressionless face now twisted into something grotesque as if caught mid-scream. The officer holding him looked back at Julia, his face grim. "You're lucky to be alive, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "This man's been on the run for days. Escaped from a maximum security prison. He's one of the most dangerous men we've ever dealt with." Julia's stomach twisted at his words. She had been locked in a house with a monster. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her legs shaking violently beneath her. What did he do? The officer looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and horror. "You don't want to know." As the man was dragged out of her house and into the blinding red and blue lights of the waiting police cars, Julia slumped against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But the relief didn't come. Even as the officers left, even as the man was gone, there was something in the air that made her skin crawl. Something in the way the house felt, like a place that had been touched by something unspeakable. And Julia couldn't shake the feeling that somehow it wasn't over.